why is the knowledge of good and evil poison? Well, that's a good question. Because most of us think that's a good thing, right? If I know what's good and I know what's evil, that's a good thing. Knowledge of good and evil is poison to the make of humanity because it's not how we were designed. We were designed for fellowship in the Spirit. By contrast to fellowship in the Spirit, which, by the way, fellowship in the Spirit, if you've walked with the Lord for any amount of time at all, fellowship in the Spirit is hard to pin down. It's mysterious. It ebbs and flows in different ways. There's seasons of attention in the Lord to one thing or another. And if you give attention to the last season in the new season, you're behind because you can't reduce it to a code. God is always engaging with us in ways that satisfy His delight for relationship. He wants relationship. He designed us for relationship. We're made in the image of a triune God who perfectly fellowships amongst themselves. There is no point in time in which the Trinity has had an argument. There's perfect communion and perfect fellowship. And this is how God made us, to live in that kind of fellowship. By contrast, the binary knowledge of good and evil. You understand binary? One or the other. Binary is not one thing. It's not many things. It's flip the switch on or off. Good, evil. That binary approach is now not the purity of heart that wills one thing. The knowledge of good and evil is an introduction of a toxin into a perfect system. And the perfect system was, I find my life in God, one thing. Now the knowledge of good and evil introduces the possibility of some alternate route. Of more than one thing, of more than purity, which is less than purity. Binary knowledge reduces life to increasingly subtle, redactional, didactic mental processes. That means I don't go to Walmart and there's one shampoo. I go to Walmart and there's 15,000 to choose from. Seriously. We are inundated with choice. We are overwhelmed with choice. We're paralyzed with choice. You think about some of the major decisions of your life, and what do? You line up the pros and the cons, and you agonize over, is this the right thing? Is this going to lead to the outcome I want? Is this the path the Lord has for me? But you aren't actually pursuing the Lord in the path. You're pursuing the knowledge of good and evil to figure out, is it going to be good for me or bad for me? You can do the knowledge of good and evil without God. That's why it's poison. The moment you know what's good and what's evil, you don't actually need God. Because you have all the information you need to make your choice. If this is good and this is evil, do the good. Avoid the evil. God is no longer a part of that equation. It's automatically a death sentence, no matter how well you do it. By contrast, the tree of life represented an entirely different mode of living. It was all about communion. It's pure fellowship with God. The tree of life was an incarnation, a representation, a literal physical tree in the garden, but it was a picture of the existence into which Adam had been born, which was namely rest. Why do I say that? Because the knowledge of good and evil creates and requires personal responsibility. Now that you know, you're responsible. That's the entire lesson of the burden of knowledge. Now that you know, you're responsible. Meanwhile, prior to that responsibility, eating from the tree of life they maintained their rest in God's finished work. You aren't responsible in that state, God is. If God leads you into evil, that's his problem. But God doesn't lead us into evil. God doesn't tempt any man. God is not a man that he should lie. In him are all the virtues and perfections possible in the universe. It all resides in him, and Adam had direct access to that. Adam and Eve had direct access to fellowship with that, the mystery of that, the daily process of that, and instead they said, I'd rather figure this out on my own. Tree of life was a picture of the rest of the Sabbath, because Sabbath only required relational responsiveness to God's guidance. In other words, all of these things become synonymous terms. The Sabbath was a picture of man living in faith. God set aside a day to intersect with his nature and character, and that's a picture of what the tree of life is, that is utter dependence on him. And so his work, his guidance, his holiness is how we live, and we just trust we just trust his action on our behalf in that. So now, does that mean that the knowledge of good and evil is bad? Isn't the knowledge of good and evil good? Well, here's the tricky part, because we hear the word good in there, right? This messes with us. We get the part where the evil's evil, but we think the good is good. But the good of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is just as much poison as the evil. Because it offers you the seductive possibility that you can be good by what you know. It offers the seductive possibility that you can know enough to be good, and that is poison. Because apart from God, there is no good. In him we live and move and have our being. Our entire essence is meant to be a reflection and manifestation of his nature. He can handle the distinctions between good and evil. He's big enough, he's powerful enough, he's got broad shoulders. But you and I, apart from him, are not meant to carry that. It's part of why we have so many moral dilemmas in the earth, where the knowledge of good and evil never stays at a pure binary. It keeps splintering into multiple binaries. And what starts out in the simplicity of black or white, and we think that's safe for us, becomes very, very gray as that continues to fragment and fracture. And the black and the white becomes charcoal gray, and the charcoal gray becomes light gray and medium gray. And then the grays become even grayer. And before long, there's this thin space of understanding of an issue. It's why you can lose an abortion argument talking about the knowledge of good and evil. Because they can bring up, well, what about this rare, unusual, impossible circumstance that slices the gray down to this, I don't know how to answer that on the spectrum of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil stretches the soul by virtue of what you were never meant to contain or process to begin with. And it leaves you worn out in trying to manage the nuances and complexities of a world that is burying us in gray. Knowledge of good and evil as a means of righteousness strengthens the basic motivation of sin, which is the desire to be independent of God. Grace does the exact opposite. It strengthens the desire of man to live in fellowship and dependence on God. Law requires zero relationship with God as the source of righteousness, the knowledge of good and evil. Think about it. If this is good and I only do good, and I keep doing the good stuff and I keep avoiding the bad stuff, I feel satisfied that I am righteous. Whether or not God is a part of my life at all. And that's why every other religious system has some form of the knowledge of good and evil as the essence of its discipleship. The challenge here, and the reason it's poison upon poison, is the only righteousness is total righteousness. And so you have to keep doing all the good stuff perfectly, with perfect motives, in perfect sophistication of all of the complications of the gray areas of life. Never doing a wrong thing, however small, however justifiable, the little white lie, whatever it is, you can only do good with perfect wisdom and perfect execution and never do bad, or the way the knowledge of good and evil works according to the law. And if you haven't figured it out yet, these are synonymous. The knowledge of good and evil is a picture of the law at work in the garden. The tree of life is a picture of grace in Christ at work in the garden. Two choices prefigured in a literal way in the garden. But if the way the law works is, it says in the New Testament, if you break any part of it, you've broken it all. That's just the nature of it. It's not a point system where you can do 100 good things and that makes up for the one bad thing. That's an offset. The one bad thing is like you just did all 100 wrong. It is a total violation. Any violation is a total violation. So now we're in double jeopardy. Man in his independence and pride is now fundamentally a rebel against the very source of righteousness he cannot possibly achieve in his rebellion. Yet, because it was his free will choice, he is now responsible by the knowledge he now possesses to choose wisely, to choose the good and avoid the evil. Romans 7 says, I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Here's part of what Paul is saying. Because the question comes up, and I'm going to have to answer this more than once. Dean, are you saying the law is wrong? The law is perfect. It doesn't produce rebellion, it confirms it. The law reveals the rebel. If you're going to relate to God and you choose the knowledge of good and evil, that knowledge of good and evil actually confirms that you are a rebel against God because you chose it instead of him. So the law works to reveal the rebel inside. It doesn't produce it, it confirms it.